My mother waited until the dessert plates were cleared before she pulled out the folder. We were at Meridian, the kind of restaurant in Nashville where the bread costs $12 and everybody speaks in a slightly lower voice than necessary. It was her 61st birthday dinner, and she had insisted on the private dining room in the back, which told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. My mother only reserved private rooms when she needed witnesses to a performance. My brother Donovan sat to her left, loosening his collar like a man who had just closed a deal. He was 33 and had spent the last 4 years telling anyone who would listen about his commercial real estate portfolio in Chicago. He wore a watch that cost more than my first car, and his wife Brielle sat beside him, wearing a cream-colored dress that she had chosen specifically to outshine the tablecloth. I was 29 years old. I was the younger one. I was an environmental compliance engineer, which meant I spent my days studying soil composition, groundwater contamination reports, and federal remediation mandates. My mother had never once introduced me at a party without a slight pause before the word engineer. The kind of pause that meant she was still trying to figure out how to make it sound impressive. She reached into her designer bag and brought out a thick cream envelope, which she slid across the white linen to Donovan with both hands, the way you'd offer something sacred. She announced that it was the commercial building on Demonbrun Street, fully paid off, freshly renovated, valued at $1.8 million, rental income already locked in for the next 3 years. Donovan opened the envelope and his grin spread slow and wide. He kissed her cheek. Brielle made a sound like she had just won something. Then my mother turned to me. The warmth didn't drain from her face, it just rerouted, like she kept a separate expression in cold storage, reserved specifically for moments involving me. She reached back into the bag and set a manila folder on my plate. The corner caught the edge of my fork and knocked it off the table. Nobody picked it up. Inside the folder were several past-due property tax notices and a deed transfer for an LLC called Haverfield Industrial Holdings. The property was a former textile mill in Tipton County, Tennessee, 45 miles north of the city. It had been out of operation for 11 years. The photographs attached showed collapsed chain-link fencing, a crumbling brick building with shattered windows, and soil around the drainage channel stained a deep orange-brown. That color is the kind that makes every environmental engineer's stomach drop on sight. The back tax bill was $38,000, due within 10 days or the county would begin seizure proceedings. Brielle leaned over to look at the photographs and laughed, a short, bright sound, and said something about how fitting it was that I finally had a project that matched my particular skill set. She said your kind of work with that specific warmth people use when they mean the opposite of warmth entirely. My mother folded her hands on the table and explained. My late father had purchased the Tipton County property years ago as a speculative investment that never materialized. It had drained her in annual property taxes ever since he passed, and she wanted it out of her name immediately. She was transferring the LLC to me today. I would assume the tax debt, the liability, all maintenance obligations, everything attached to it. She said if I refused or failed to pay the back taxes within 10 days, she would remove me from the remainder of the family trust. No contact, no holidays, no share of what was left. Donovan swirled his bourbon and said I should be grateful. He used the word with the casual confidence of someone who has never had to be grateful for anything in his life. I looked at the deed. I looked at the LLC name, Haverfield Industrial Holdings, and something moved through my chest. Not fear, recognition. 6 months earlier, while cross-referencing contamination reports for a client project, I had come across a flagged EPA investigation tied to a property in Tipton County, Tennessee, held under a company called Haverfield Industrial Holdings. I had noted it professionally and moved on. I hadn't known it was my family's. I knew exactly what was inside that folder, and I knew something else about that parcel of land that nobody seated at that table could have possibly known. I picked up my pen and signed the transfer documents without a single word. Stood up, placed a $100 bill on the table to cover my drink, told them to enjoy the rest of their evening, and walked out into the cool Nashville night. I sat in my car for a moment with the folder in my lap. Then I drove north. The drive to Tipton County took 45 minutes. I arrived just after 10, headlights cutting through the dark and the fog settling over the access road. I stepped out and the smell reached me immediately, not just the damp rot of an abandoned structure, but something underneath it, metallic and chemical, the kind of odor that parks itself in the back of your throat and doesn't leave. I walked the old drainage line with a flashlight. The soil along the runoff channel was discolored in the pattern I had documented dozens of times at remediation sites. Iron compounds, heavy metals, the signature staining of industrial solvent disposal. I photographed everything, noted the GPS coordinates, then went back to my car and opened my laptop. I logged into the EPA's enforcement database and typed in the property identification number from the deed. The results loaded in 11 seconds. Haverfield Industrial Holdings had been under active federal investigation for 3 years. The state had flagged elevated concentrations of trichloroethylene and hexavalent chromium in the groundwater, traced to illegal disposal practices during the mill's operation. The site had been added to the preliminary remediation registry. The Environmental Protection Agency was in the final stages of preparing a formal consent order against the current legal owner of the LLC. A mandatory directive to fund complete environmental cleanup, estimated at $1.4 million. Non-compliance would result in federal civil penalties and potential criminal prosecution of the responsible party on record. My mother had received every one of those notices. As executor of my father's estate, every certified letter would have been delivered directly to her. She had known for at least 2 years that this LLC was a federal time bomb, and tonight, over birthday cake and wine, she had handed the detonator to me so her golden boy could walk away clean. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark in that crumbling parking lot. I let myself feel it for exactly 60 seconds, the specific, devastating clarity of understanding that the person who was supposed to protect you had instead calculated how to use you as a shield. I cried, one hard sob that fogged the windshield. Then I breathed, and the grief burned off, and what remained underneath was colder and far more useful. I was an environmental compliance engineer. I understood federal remediation law the way Donovan believed he understood commercial real estate. And while reviewing the county property maps, I had noticed something my mother, in all her scheming, had never bothered to look for. The 12 acres directly adjacent to this toxic lot, separated by a deteriorating fence line, had been listed for private sale for 8 months. The soil on that parcel was clean, the groundwater tested within normal parameters, and the county had recently approved an agricultural incentive program offering significant tax credits for certified sustainable farming operations in the region. I opened a new tab and started reading. I paid the $38,000 in back taxes the following week by cashier's check. The county clerk gave me a sympathetic look I didn't need. Keeping Haverfield Industrial Holdings active was step 1 of the plan. As long as the LLC existed with current taxes, my mother would assume I was quietly sinking under the weight of her debt. She would think she had won cleanly and completely. My real business happened 3 offices down the hall, where I registered a brand new LLC under a name connected to nothing in my family's history. I called it Clearfield Botanical Group. I placed a cash offer on the 12 adjacent acres. 10 days later, they were mine. The climate in that part of Tennessee is exceptional for lavender. Not the decorative garden variety, culinary and therapeutic grade lavender, the kind that high-end food producers, cosmetic manufacturers, and specialty wellness brands pay a serious premium to source domestically. I had researched the market for 2 months before I signed anything. I also established a boutique environmental consulting practice operating from the same property, helping regional developers navigate EPA compliance requirements and avoid exactly the kind of catastrophe my mother had tried to bury me under. I worked from before sunrise to well past dark every single day for 18 months. I hired carefully, paid fairly, and built something that was entirely mine. I did not answer my mother's calls. I blocked my brother on every platform. I erased myself from their world completely. The silence was the most peaceful stretch of time I had ever experienced in my adult life. The article ran on a Thursday morning in a regional business journal covering the Mid-South economy. A journalist had approached me 6 weeks earlier wanting to profile what she called a new model of dual-operation sustainable enterprise. The piece featured a photograph of me standing in the middle of the lavender field at full bloom, rows of purple stretching to the tree line behind me. The headline read, "From Compliance to Cultivation, How One Engineer Built a $6 million Green Enterprise in Rural Tennessee." I didn't know Brielle had found it until my mother called from her landline 2 days later. I answered out of curiosity, the specific morbid curiosity that makes you slow down to look. My mother didn't ask how I was. She launched immediately into a speech about family obligation. She said Donovan was experiencing a significant liquidity challenge, His commercial building in Chicago had lost 60% of its market value in the ongoing commercial real estate correction, and the bank was threatening foreclosure proceedings. She needed me to pull a line of credit against the Tipton County property and wire $40,000 to Donovan's account by the end of the week. For the family's reputation. I asked why Donovan didn't simply sell the Demon Brown building if he needed cash so urgently. Her voice went up 2 full registers. She told me the Damon Brune building was a legacy asset that could not be touched. She called me selfish. She called me ungrateful. She started listing everything she had supposedly sacrificed for me. A list I had heard so many times I could have recited it back to her in the dark. I waited for her to take a breath and then I pressed the red button. I knew they would come. The moment Brielle saw that article, the valuation, the photograph of the house I had built on the hill, the lavender stretching to the horizon, they would not ask for $40,000. They would come to take everything. So I did something that will make some of you want to shout at your screen. I let them. I need you to understand why before you judge it, because this is the part that matters. For Donovan to walk into the trap, he had to believe he had already won. A man like my brother does not sign documents under pressure. He calls attorneys, demands audits, stalls for months. But a man who believes he is the inevitable victor, he signs whatever is put in front of him without reading a single word. I needed him comfortable. I needed him arrogant. I needed him to walk into that attorney's office on his own 2 feet, in front of a notary and witnesses, and deliver himself into his own destruction. That required letting him believe, for a few days, that he had already taken the castle. Kicking them out the moment they arrived would have made him suspicious. Surrendering would make him sloppy. I needed him sloppy. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I watched the rental car on my security camera. My mother in the passenger seat, Brielle in the back on her phone, Donovan driving with the ease of a man arriving somewhere that already belongs to him. They walked through my front door, which I had deliberately left unlocked, and made themselves at home while I was still out in the south field. By the time I walked back to the house, my mother had claimed the primary bedroom downstairs. Brielle was directing Kezia, my property manager, who holds a master's degree in agricultural business and has more professionalism in her left hand than anyone in that rental car, to rearrange furniture according to Brielle's aesthetic preferences. She spoke to Kezia slowly and loudly and with a particular brand of condescension that I recognized immediately and that made the muscles in Kezia's jaw go tight in a way I had never seen before. Donovan was at my kitchen island pouring himself a glass from the good whiskey bottle, surveying the room with the studied eye of someone calculating what he'd liquidate first. I stood in the doorway. I counted to 10. Brielle noticed me without fully turning and said the house was larger than she'd expected, but the finishes were a bit rustic for her taste. She said she'd need to get some people in before they could really settle. Donovan raised his glass at me and said I'd taken long enough. I told Kezia she could take the rest of the afternoon off with full pay. Then I offered to make coffee. I gave them 4 days. I let my mother walk the property with my neighbors, introducing herself as the primary visionary and investor behind the entire operation. I let Brielle post daily to her social media, lavender field videos, captions about embracing country life, photographs taken from my wraparound porch with the view of the hills behind her. I let Donovan wander into my office where I had placed the Haverfield Industrial Holdings binder in the center drawer of the filing cabinet, the original LLC documents in a clean new folder, clearly labeled, sitting right on top as though it had been waiting for exactly him. He came to find me that evening. He set the binder on the kitchen counter and told me he had reviewed the corporate structure, and it was obvious to any serious business mind that the entire operation had been built on the foundation of the family's original land asset. He said the company and everything attached to it was rightfully the property of the family trust. He said he would be assuming the role of chief executive, effective immediately, and I could remain in a limited support capacity if I conducted myself appropriately. My mother nodded along with everything he said. Brielle examined her nails. I asked for a few weeks. I made my shoulders drop. I let my voice go soft and unsteady. I looked at my mother and said I had poured 2 years of my life into this land, and I just needed time to process letting it go. I asked if she could give me until the end of the month. Donovan glanced at Brielle. They exchanged the particular look of people who have already won and can afford to be magnanimous. He told me I had 2 weeks. He warned me not to move any funds or touch the accounts. He said his attorneys were watching. I thanked him. I went upstairs. I sent an email to my attorney, Mr. Hartley, with completely steady hands. That evening, I found my mother alone in the kitchen, and I gave her the only warning I had left to offer. I asked her, quietly, directly, looking her in the eye, whether she was absolutely certain she understood what Haverfield Industrial Holdings was, whether she remembered the condition of that property on the night she pushed the folder across the restaurant table. I was practically handing her the map. She thought I was trying to scare her out of proceeding. She laughed. She said Donovan had a brilliant financial mind and could handle whatever operational challenges came with running a real enterprise. She pointed a finger at my chest and said I had always been jealous and petty and I always would be. I let her finish. I smiled at her and said she was absolutely right, that Donovan would handle it just fine. Then I walked away from my mother for the last time. The morning of the signing, I wore a navy blazer and drove my own car to Mr. Hartley's downtown office. I arrived early and sat in the conference room with a cup of coffee until I heard Donovan's rental car in the parking garage below. He walked in like he was accepting an award. My mother followed in a silk blouse. Brielle was texting. Mr. Hartley went through the documents without rushing. When he reached Section 4, he read it aloud at my request in a clear voice, without editorial. The transferee hereby accepts full and absolute responsibility for all assets, liabilities, outstanding federal obligations, and legal proceedings associated with Haverfield Industrial Holdings, LLC, effective upon execution. I looked directly at Donovan and asked if he understood what he was agreeing to. He leaned back and said he didn't need a lecture from a local attorney. He said he had reviewed the assets himself. He said I was dragging out the process because I was a sore loser and it was becoming embarrassing for everyone. He picked up the pen. He did not read the second page. He did not check the property parcel identification number printed in the margin header. He flipped to the signature line and wrote his name with a fast, aggressive stroke, the signature of someone who signs frequently and has long since stopped paying attention to what they're signing. My mother pressed her hands together softly. Mr. Hartley stamped the notary seal. I reached into my jacket pocket and set a single rusted key on the mahogany table between us. Faded yellow tag on the ring, an address written in black marker, Vance Road, Tipton County. Donovan looked at the key. He looked at me. I told him that was the key to the gate of his new property. I told him that Haverfield Industrial Holdings had never owned the lavender farm, the processing facility, the consulting practice, or the house on the hill. Every one of those assets had been held exclusively under Clearfield Botanical Group since the month after I paid his mother's back taxes. I had registered the two companies separately, kept them entirely distinct, never merged a single dollar between them. The company he had just signed for owned 40 acres of federally contaminated land and $1.4 million in pending EPA remediation costs. I told him the Vance Road address was right there on the tag. He should type it into his GPS. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked out. I did not look back once. I was on my porch with a cup of coffee when the federal vehicles came down Vance Road just before noon, 2 EPA enforcement trucks and 1 IRS vehicle moving fast. A formal consent order had been issued to Haverfield Industrial Holdings 3 weeks prior, with a 14-day response window that had expired. That morning's signed transfer, filed electronically within the hour by Mr. Hartley's office, had automatically updated the Federal Registry with the new owner of record. The agencies had been notified as a matter of standard protocol. I raised my mug when Donovan found me on the hill through the fence line. He started running toward the property boundary. He made it halfway before the lead EPA agent stepped in front of him, identified himself, and asked to confirm that Donovan was the newly registered sole owner of Haverfield Industrial Holdings, LLC. Donovan said there had been a mistake. The agent said there had not been a mistake. I watched the handcuffs go on from 300 yards away, in the late morning light, over the top of my lavender in second bloom. I watched Brielle pull out her phone, start recording, and then slowly turn the camera on herself. Tears on her face, voice shaking, announcing to her followers that her husband had ruined everything, and she was filing for divorce the moment she got back to the city. I watched my mother cross the contaminated ground to my fence line and sink to her knees in the orange dirt, her silk blouse picking up the stain of 11 years of toxic runoff, her voice carrying across the open field. She called my name. She said we were family. She used every phrase she had ever used on me: duty, blood, what I owed her, what she had sacrificed. I walked down from the porch and crossed the lawn and stopped at the fence, a few feet from where she was kneeling. I looked at her and I searched myself honestly. I looked for guilt. I looked for the old reflex to fix whatever she was feeling, to make myself smaller so she could feel better. I looked for the little girl who had spent a decade trying to earn something from this woman that she was never willing to give. There was nothing left. She had spent all of it, every last bit of it, a long time ago. I told her quietly that she was the one who said Donovan had the business mind. I told her she was the one who said he could handle anything that came with running a real operation. I told her I hoped she was right. Then I turned around and walked back inside and locked the door. That was 14 months ago now. Donovan was indicted on 4 federal counts: failure to respond to a federal consent order, criminal negligence under the Clean Water Act, and 2 counts related to fraudulent misrepresentation of the LLC's assets to a private lender he had used to lease a vehicle the week before the signing. He took a plea to avoid trial, 54 months in federal corrections. The Chicago building had already been in pre-foreclosure proceedings before any of this, which no one in my family had known because no one in my family had ever thought to ask. Brielle filed the divorce paperwork the same week she announced it on the live stream. She moved fast and she moved thoroughly, and I'll give her credit for that. My mother spent what remained of her savings on attorneys who told her, correctly, that there was nothing that could be done. The transfer had been legal, voluntary, notarized, and witnessed. There was no coercion. There was no trick in any legal sense. There was only her son signing a document without reading it because he had spent his entire life believing that rules existed for other people. She is in a senior living facility outside of Nashville now, a small room, a window facing the parking lot. Donovan cannot visit. I have not visited. That is not cruelty, it is honesty. I stopped pretending to be her daughter a long time before she stopped pretending to be my mother, and I no longer see the use in continuing a performance that serves no one. Here in Tipton County, my lavender is heading into its 3rd bloom. Kezia manages the day-to-day with a team of 16 people, all of whom receive fair wages, full benefits, and the basic dignity of being spoken to like the professionals they are. We signed a national supply contract last autumn that will anchor our revenue for the next 5 years. The consulting practice grew faster than I projected, and I have had to turn down work, which is the best kind of problem to have. Last Sunday, I hosted dinner at the long oak table my contractor built from reclaimed timber, and the people who sat around it were the ones who chose to show up. Kezia and her husband, 2 of my former professors who drove in from Memphis, a neighbor who brought her daughter, a friend from graduate school who made a 4-hour drive just to be there. We ate outside while the lavender was still holding color in the late light, and somebody brought a playlist that had us all talking over each other in the way that only happens when everyone at the table actually wants to be there. These are the people who get a seat at my table, not because of blood, because of the choice they make every time to show up. I used to believe that family was something you were born into and obligated to carry at any cost. My mother built her entire life on that belief, and she used it as a weapon she called love. What I understand now, standing on land I bought and built with my own hands, is that you cannot grow anything living in poisoned soil. You have to test the ground before you plant. You have to know what's underneath before you commit. And sometimes you have to look at what you've been given and recognize it for exactly what it is. Not an inheritance, not a gift, but someone else's damage with your name signed on it. If that found you today, you already know what I mean. Leave a comment and tell me how you handled it. And if this story is one someone in your life needs to hear, please share it. Thank you for listening to mine.